Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm pleased to introduce you to Annette Libeskind Berkovits. Annette grew up in post-war Poland and the fledgling state of Israel before coming to America at the age of 16. Despite being uprooted from country to country, Annette has channeled her passions into writing and has published 2 memoirs, short stories, and some poetry. She joins me today to discuss her latest memoir, Aftermath, Coming of Age on 3 Continents. Well, welcome to Uncorking a Story, Annette.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Mike.
I am so happy to have you here, and I have to ask you the question I ask everybody to kick us off, which is, Annette, where does your story begin?
My story begins at the foothills of the Himalayas in the Fergana Valley that was strewn with fields of red poppies, which is my earliest memory.
That is a very descriptive, that's very descriptive there. Well, tell me, what was it like growing up there?
Well, I left when I was a little girl, but I have a really vivid memory of it. For me, it's a wonderful memory. I even remember standing in a crib in a peach orchard as a little tot, trying to reach every peach and nicking each one of them with my 2 front teeth. My parents were very fortunate. They had survived Soviet gulags, and they went, when they were released from the gulags, war was still raging on the West, so they couldn't go back home to Poland. So they went as far south as they could. And the Himalayas were too formidable for them to cross. So they were there. But it was the Soviet government, and their lives were extremely difficult. Of course, as a young child, I was unaware of it. Mm-hmm. When the war was over, all they wanted to do was to get back to Poland, where they came from. They were each from different cities in Poland. My mother was born in Warsaw, the capital, and my father in Łódź, which was the second largest city in Poland. They wanted to get back and look for their relatives, but when we got there, no one was left, and doors slammed, and we couldn't leave. So I grew up in Poland for the first 10 years.
Wow. So they had to contend with Hitler on one side and Stalin on the other.
Exactly.
Yeah, with no home.
Right. And yet, in a perverse kind of twist of history, because they escaped from Poland to the Soviet Union, their lives were saved. They would have been murdered with the rest of their families had they not escaped. My father, especially in 1939, September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, my father knew right away that the German military would be different. He had experienced German military when he was a little boy. He was a 5-year-old during the First World War. And the German soldiers that he ran into in Poland were very nice to him. But when he heard what was happening in September, when the Nazis came in, and the way they flew the planes low and they were just mowing people down as though they were grass, he said, "This is going to be different. I'm going to leave." And he tried to persuade all his siblings to go with him, and they thought he was crazy, crossing the river where the 2 opposing militaries, the Nazis on one side and the Soviets on the other, shooting at each other, trying to swallow up Poland. And he did escape. My mother escaped in a similar way. They did not know one another at the time. And so they ended up being arrested and rounded up because they didn't choose Soviet citizenship when they came to the Soviet Union. So my father was sentenced to hard labor, way north of Moscow. Very, very cold, forbidding terrain. It's impenetrable forests where you cannot escape because you would not survive. And my mother was sentenced to Siberia. So they each had a very rough time, but miraculously, there was a pact between the Polish government in London and Polish government in exile in London and Stalin to release the Polish prisoners with the hope that they would go and fight on the Soviet side. And those that survived, and many thousands died of starvation, mostly starvation and disease. Well, they managed to survive. So that's how they were saved. Their lives were saved.
Yeah. So when you got to Poland with your family, paint a picture for me of what it was like there. It sounds like there was no extended family left.
There was no family left. And I'm glad you asked me this question, because I'll tell you a story that sounds like so amazingly difficult that people think it's like improbable. But my mother was 9 months pregnant when we trekked from Kyrgyzstan to Poland, and we traveled by cattle train, where my parents slept on the floor of the cattle car. And I remember it very, very vividly, because the train stopped constantly. It was not a direct route. It took, I think, about 2 months for us to make that trip in this cattle car. And every time it stopped, I remember my father hopping off the train, taking a sort of a dented teapot and putting it under the locomotive to catch the dripping, the steam.
Yeah.
Have warm water. So my mother washed me with that water. And she was very pregnant during that trip. And on the first night when we arrived, oddly enough, in Auschwitz, which in Polish is called Oświęcim, and it's the place where the gauge of the train tracks changes. So to get on a passenger train, you have to wait for another train. Now, my father carried with us a big sack of salt, because that was the only thing he had. He thought for some reason that it had value. That was his only possession. But the sack of salt was too big to get on a passenger train. They wouldn't allow him on the passenger train. So he instructed my mother to take me, I was just under 3, and to go to the city that he came from, because he heard via the survivor grapevine that his sister, who was an Auschwitz survivor, was in the city of Łódź. So my mother had never met her because they married in Kyrgyzstan. And he said, go, she will take care of you, and you'll be okay. So he managed to put my mother and me on the train. And when we arrived, there was curfew. The Soviets had imposed a curfew. So my mother and I were walking through a street. She was trying to find the address. She didn't know that city. She had never been there. Of course, no transportation. She was walking. And I was a little kid. And I remember this. I insisted on being carried. And, my mother she weighed 90 pounds. She was so emaciated because they were so starved in the Soviet Union. And it got dark, and we passed by a guardhouse that was guarded by a Soviet military woman. And I remember her because she looked to me like a huge statue in a green military coat. And she said to my mother in Russian, my mother knew some Russian by then, "What are you doing out? You're going to get arrested." And she noticed that my mother was pregnant. And she took pity on her. And she said, "Come into my guardhouse," a teeny little guardhouse. She said, "I have to stand on guard duty. You come in here with your child and lie down." My mother put me to sleep. And I still remember the the roughness of the military blanket on my face when my mother covered me up. I fell asleep, and my mother went into labor.
Oh my goodness.
And she had nowhere to go, and somehow or other, this guard helped her get to a homeless shelter for Jewish refugees. And that's where my brother was born. Now, miraculously, time and experience makes a difference in one's life trajectory, because my brother is now one of the most famous architects in the world, but he had a very rough start in life.
Yeah, but geez, and you're so young and you remember this with such clarity.
I do, because it was, I think you remember the things that are very impactful in your life that are traumatic. So, yes. And speaking of uncorking a story, I uncorked my story yesterday in my brother's studio. He hosted my book launch, Studio Libeskind. My brother is the master planner for rebuilding Ground Zero and many notable museums around the world. So he hosted the launch event at his studio. It was fabulous.
That's a very proper place. I have to know though, your father and the salt, whatever became of the salt, did it have value?
What turned out, I'm glad you asked, because nobody asked me that part of the story. My father was very upset that he put my mother in her 9th month with a child to go to an unknown place. He was very, very anxious that he did that. And of course, my mother gave birth without him being present, which I think she never forgave him. But he could not get that sack of salt on any train, so he left it at the train station and came the next day. So,
you know what I'm wondering though, and there's of course no way of knowing, but if he had left the salt and went with you, and you wound up, at that guardhouse with, if that woman, that soldier, would have taken as much pity on you and your mother as she did, if your father had been with you.
probably not. Probably not. Because, you see a pregnant, very pregnant woman out at night with a little child, you're more likely to have compassion.
Yeah. So that probably worked out the way it should have worked out. And an alternative, you never know. I don't know.
You never know.
These are questions we can't answer, but we can only hypothesize. Well, tell me about Aftermath. I know you've written some other, memoir before, but tell me what can you share with me about this book?
Well, Aftermath is the story of my growing up and my interest in writing the story. I apologize if you hear noise. There's construction in my building. I can't do anything.
It's New York City. What are you going to do?
My intent in writing the story was to show that even children who are growing up with the shadow of the Holocaust can grow up to be successful human beings, that your past doesn't need to be your destiny. When I was growing up, I felt I was growing up in a normal childhood, but in retrospect, I know that I wasn't, because we had no family. So every birthday, every holiday was celebrated with myself, my brother, and my parents. We were a very close nuclear family, but it was just us. There was never anybody else around us, which was very difficult. And we spent many weekends, not all weekends, but I would say maybe most weekends in Poland. My father would take us to the cemetery to clean up my grandparents' graves. His parents died before the war, and he always told us, when we were young kids, how lucky they were that they died before the war. And it was hard for me to understand as a child, how was it lucky to die? But he also always took us to the wall in the cemetery where they shot the ghetto prisoners. So that was the context of growing up. And the post-war Poland under communism, aside from the burden of the Holocaust, was a very grim place. It was a very gray place. And it's interesting when I think of about it, I don't see the images in color. Everything seems gray.
Mm.
Things are gray. The flowers are gray. I don't. And it's probably colored by my experience. My experience there wasn't happy, even though at the time I was living it, I don't think I was an unhappy girl growing up. But then we came to Israel as soon as my parents were able to get out, which was very difficult because you needed to get exit visas. My grandkids often ask me, why didn't they just leave? Well, I tell them, you couldn't just leave. You needed permission to leave. And several times the Polish government issued exit visas and revoked them when everything was gotten rid of, packed, and you had to start over again. So I think it was the fourth or maybe the fifth time where they got the permits to leave. I remember these gigantic wooden crates appearing in our living room because we only had 2 rooms. It was a very modest place, a living room and a bedroom. The living room was filled with a giant wooden crate into which my parents just threw everything in. And any money that they had left over, they bought things like bicycles and linens and you name it. Everything went into that crate. The crate was sealed and we were gone. And it was so dramatic for me because one day I was living, life as a 6th grader, and next day we were on a train heading towards Italy because we boarded a ship in Naples, and my parents had very, very few possessions, but my mother had her gold ring. She had a gold necklace. And she was afraid that those would be taken away. So she sewed them into the hem of my coat. And I was warned many times, don't call attention to this because the guards will come on the train. They will ask for our identity papers. Don't fidget with your coat. Don't. And I was terrified.
Yeah.
Because nothing happened, but it was just. And then after this whole experience, we arrive in Israel. Of course, the weather is so different. Skies were brilliantly blue, and the water, I had never been near an ocean. So when we saw the Mediterranean, it was like, it was something so extraordinary. And then when the ship pulled into the harbor and they pulled up the plank, there was all this family running up. My mother's brother, who was an Auschwitz survivor, who survived as a teenager and somehow got to Israel, for it was Palestine when he got there. And his whole family, they were all coming to greet us. My mother had 2 sisters who had gone to settle Palestine years before. That's how they survived. So suddenly there was family, all these people around us. It was overwhelming. And my mother had a sister who was one of the founders of a kibbutz in Israel, in the Galilee. And we went there, and cedar trees and everything was so different. There was nothing familiar there.
Yeah.
And not to speak of the language. I mean, there couldn't be 2 more different languages than Polish and Hebrew.
Well, just looking back on her childhood, when do you start seeing in color? If Poland was black and white, is this a period of time that you're reimagining or you're kind of reliving in color, or did that happen at a different point? Yeah.
No, like it happened there. I started seeing colors when we came to Israel. But then, you learn the language. And as I said, the 2 languages couldn't be more different. The characters are different. The sounds are different. For people who don't know Hebrew, they don't realize that Hebrew is written without vowels. So it's very difficult to read when you're learning it. They have dots that signify the vowels below the words when you're learning it. But once you've learned it, adult texts don't have indications for the vowels. You're just supposed to know the words. So I learned the language. I get used to it. And boom, another bomb is thrown into my life. My father says, I'm leaving. For my father, Israel was a very big disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
Why? A lot of people are very, very surprised by that. And I'll tell you why. Because in Poland, my father was very reluctant to speak his language. He grew up with Yiddish. Yiddish was his mother tongue. And he couldn't wait to go to a country with our Jews where he could speak Yiddish. And the minute he opened his mouth in Yiddish in Israel, it was anathema. Don't speak that language. Because they were building a new country with a language that had been reserved only for religious texts, and now it was being used for everyday language. So they wanted everyone to speak Hebrew. My father didn't know any Hebrew, so he had no way to communicate.
Yeah.
It was extremely frustrating to him. But it was more than frustrating, it was insulting that he felt a Jew in a Jewish country couldn't speak his language. It was very offensive, and he couldn't get a job. Why? He was 47 or 48. He was really too old to get a job. Israel was a young country. They wanted young people to build a country. And in Poland, he had been administrator. To have any administrative jobs, you need the language. He didn't have the language, and he was on the old side, so he couldn't work. And he had worked all his life. For him, not working was so demoralizing. And then he found his sister, the one sister that from his large family that survived Auschwitz, in Pennsylvania, in the U.S. And she said, "Come here. You will get a house, and you will have a job, and you will have a great life. You've got to come." So she started trying to influence both a Republican and a Democratic senator from her state. She tried from both sides. And he got called in by the American embassy in Tel Aviv. He was astounded. He came in and he got called in for an interview. And the interviewer said to him, how did you get all this political influence in the US? And he had no idea, because he didn't know what she had done. So he didn't know what they were talking about. He was very nervous. And they said, "Well, we have a letter here from this senator and a letter from that senator. We're going to issue a visa for you." So my father was thrilled, but guess what? The thrill didn't last long, because he thought the visa was for the whole family. It was just for him. So he had to leave me and my brother and my mother behind. And at the time, we had no idea if or when we would ever see him again, because we didn't know if he could get another visa. So for me, it was an extremely difficult time, because I did not want to leave Israel. I had no desire whatsoever. As a matter of fact, when I was a kid growing up in Poland, America was painted as such a devil by the communist government. It was a place I did not want to go. The only thing that was here, it was my father. I was very close with my father, so I was very, very torn, because my mother had a business in Israel. She had her sister, she had family, she was happy, and suddenly we were torn out by our roots. And there I am, arriving in New York as a 16-year-old, 2 weeks before school starts, not speaking a word of English, terrified about how am I going to go to school? Teen with all the normal angst of a teen. And then you can't speak the language, and you're supposed to enter 10th grade. So the story of how I ended up going to the Bronx High School of Science, I don't know how much you know about the school, but in 1959, when I entered the school, it was then considered the best public high school in America. and getting into it was very, very difficult. Huge numbers of students took the test. They admitted very few, and you had to take an entrance test. Well, it turned out, I found out many years later that I'm the only student who has ever attended that school without taking the entrance test.
I was going to say, how could you even take the test if you couldn't read or write or speak English?
Well, I couldn't. I don't really want to divulge the story because it's described in fine detail in my book, but I managed to persuade the principal.
I need to pause here for a moment, just reflect on a few things that you've been talking about. So you mentioned your father's age, 47, 48. And I'm thinking to myself, I just turned 48 a couple of weeks ago. And I'm thinking about, a few things. Our lives were very different, my life and your father's, but your father had left his family twice, the first to escape Hitler, only to, go into a gulag, and then work his way back. And then he leaves his family again, Israel to Pennsylvania. Now, I mean, if I had to choose any state in this country, and I don't know that I would have chosen Pennsylvania, but that's, I guess beggars can't be choosers. No offense to Pennsylvania, but and then you, I mean, and then your life is not easy either, right? I mean, because you're moving around so much, and you're finally somewhere where you love, you're seeing in color now. You've got your mother, her sister, your brother. You're learning the language, and then you uproot again to go to the United States, this place that has been, a lot of propaganda has been fed to you about what it's really like. I'm curious, were you surprised at all when you came to the United States that it may not have been what you'd been told?
Okay, so I'll tell you, I have a story that responds to your question, which is described in the book, but I'll give you the short version of it. On the very first day, when we arrived, we went to an apartment that my father had rented for the family. It was a sublet in the Bronx on the 5th floor walk up. It was, I think, an old lady that had gone to a nursing home, and her family sublet her apartment. So her closets were stuffed with her coats and mothballs. So I remember the smell of mothballs first coming into the apartment. The drawers were filled with her underwear. It was, we were living in somebody else's home essentially. And I woke, that was the first impression of when we walked in there. And I said to my father, are we going to live here? And he said, well, yes, until I find another place. And I said, when will that be? And he said, we'll see. And we had lived in a sublet apartment in Israel. So I was not happy. I wanted us to have a place of our own again, like we had in Poland. So the next morning when I woke up, there was a big courtyard in the building. And I said, I want to see this America. I'm here. I feel completely alien and uprooted. I'll just go downstairs. So I went down the 5 flights of stairs. And in the courtyard, I saw a girl who seemed to be more or less my age, or at least I judged her to be my age. And she started talking to me, of course, and I was gesticulating, trying to say, I don't understand. And I think pretty quickly she got the idea that I was not an English speaker. And I know this woman till today. This was like more than 60 years ago. But this is what happened. She grabbed my hand and she said something, which was, come with me. And this was in the Bronx. So I walked with her, and I was sort of agog at everything. And we came to a street where I was able to read the sign. It said Broadway. And I'm looking around and I'm seeing there's all these car dealerships. Well, I didn't know they were car dealerships because I'd never seen one, but I saw lots of cars and a subway overhead. And I'm thinking, from what I've heard about New York, Broadway lights. What is this? This I've been duped. This is not what Broadway is supposed to be. So we cross the street across Broadway, and she drags me into a Woolworth store. And I had never been in a department store, never seen one in Israel, there were none in Poland at the time. And I'm looking at a store that's got things as varied as, I don't know, linens and pots and school supplies, and I'm just totally incredulous. And then she drags me over to these tall stools covered in red. It's a counter. And she orders a Coca-Cola. Now, what I read about Coca-Cola in Poland in the 50s, I thought it was a drug. So I'm sitting here, I'm thinking to myself, I'm sitting here on Broadway drinking Coca-Cola. I feel like I'm in a dream. So that blew my mind on day one.
I could imagine that being overwhelming. Now, did your mother come? Did she leave Israel?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we came together.
Yeah,
it was very hard for my mother.
Yeah.
It was, my parents were a wonderful couple. They loved each other very much, but my father's leaving, it could have meant a breakup of a marriage. But in the final analysis, my mother said, no, I will come.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy for her.
And then I mean, she could hold that over him, just like not being there when your brother was born.
Yes, that one, that was the worst. I think that was his worst crime.
So kind of writing this book, and I know it's not your first book, nor is it your first memoir, but did you uncover anything unique about yourself during the writing process for this? Anything? Did you learn anything new about yourself?
I did, and it wasn't just the writing process itself. It's when my manuscript went out to advanced reviewers, because my publisher wanted it to go out to advanced reviews. I got a lot of advanced reviews that said, you carried such a heavy burden as a child. And I didn't quite realize that. It hit me only recently, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I talked to a lot of authors, and one insight that I've learned is that, writing, whether or not we realize it when we're doing it, but writing can be a form of therapy. And it sounds like it may have been in your case as well.
Absolutely. And I've experienced that sense of therapy in writing my poetry book. I published a poetry book called Erythra Thalassa, Brain Disrupted. Now, Erythra Thalassa stands for the Red Sea in Greek. And the reason I titled the book that way, because it was the image that I had when my son, who was 46 at the time, had a hemorrhagic stroke, and his brain was flooded with blood.
Oh my gosh.
And I was so heartbroken over it. And he is thankfully alive with us, but he is severely disabled. And it was a trauma of a different kind, a mother watching a son so devastated that it moved me to write and to heal myself with poetry. And I put that book out, and a lot of people that have had family members in pain or injured or suffering in some way as a result of particularly a child suffering, they relate to this poetry book, and it was healing for me.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, there is, a lot of weight, and I would imagine, a lot of children of survivors of the Holocaust bear a lot of weight, from that. I imagine, there's stories you hear, just the way you were brought up, and of course, I'm deep going into my old Freudian head here, because I was a student of that. Carl Jung talks about the collective unconscious, and and how groups of people and sort of share a common background, and that sort of we inherit that. Is that true for you? I mean, do you feel like you bear some of that weight?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I learned from my father, especially, about the responsibility of passing on the collective history. So I've written my first memoir was really writing about his survival and how, as a subsequent generation, I had a different take on various issues related to Poland and to the extermination of the Jews and so forth. I was very reluctant to go back to Poland, but my father wanted to go back. A lot of people don't want to. So it was a very interesting contrast for me that I wanted to examine in the book. So I wrote that one, but he populated my entire childhood with people that were murdered, not just his family, but his friends and his teachers, and I just feel a responsibility to pass it on. And recently, my daughter, who is yet a third generation, wrote a story about the impact of anti-Semitism that she just had published in the Jewish Writing Project. So that history, as you say, it gets passed down the generations.
Yeah.
And when it doesn't, it's a real problem. I had my book launch yesterday, and one of the participants approached me and said, "I'm so glad to read your book because my parents didn't tell me anything about their background. And I'm hoping that by reading your story, I will learn a little bit of mine." And it made me very sad for that woman.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what their motivations may have been, but I have to ask, because something is catching my eye on your windowsill.
Yeah.
What is that green what's that green thing on your windowsill?
Which I'll stand up and I'll point.
Okay, you're getting warmer. No, a little bit over to
Yes.
there, that green thing. Yeah, what is that?
Okay, I will tell you. He appears as a character in my next story, my next book. I'm writing a magical realism book.
Okay.
This is a Chinese figure. I traveled a lot to China.
Yeah.
For my work. I worked in wildlife conservation for 34 years. And when I saw these, there was a pair of guardians. I have to show you both because then the story won't make sense. Okay. Most people look at them and think they're the same. Do you see the difference?
One's got an open mouth, one's got a closed mouth. Yeah.
Well, I asked the question of this was an antique, it was an antique fair in Shanghai. And I said, why? And they were sold as a pair. And I said, well, why is one's mouth open and one's not? He said, the one that has the mouth open is the female because she talks all the time. And the other one is the male. And I said, oh, you chauvinist, I'm going to buy them. I'm going to buy them and display them to remember always that chauvinism can carry through art.
I'm glad I asked you to show me that. My grandmother, if we took a trip back in time 40 years to Pompano Beach, Florida, my grandmother's best friend was a woman named Gloria Tanner. She lived right above us. So we were in 1002. She was 1102. You walk into Gloria's apartment. She has those two statues right as you walk in. And my twin brother and I named them. We named one Constantinople. I can't remember what we named it. I'd have to ask my brother, but we named them. She had the same two statues. Those two guardians in her apartment. She used to live in Singapore, so she had a lot of that type of art in her place. But wow, that's a small world situation.
Big in Asia, yes. If you looked closely, they probably one had its mouth closed and one open.
You know what? I wish I could, but she has left us.
I'll see if your brother remembers.
Yeah, I will. I will ask. I will ask Jimmy if he remembers that. So congratulations on the launch of the book. And then where can people buy Aftermath: Coming of Age on Three Continents?
It's available on Amazon, and then you could be requested at any bookstore. Amazon has a Kindle edition, a paperback edition, and a hardcover. I don't know if you've seen it here.
Oh, there it is. Beautiful book cover.
There it is. Yes, and I have to say something about the book cover, Mike, because I didn't get a chance to say it. First of all, it was designed by my niece, who is an artist, Rachel Libeskind. She is my brother's daughter, inherited his talent in art. But these colors around here, they're really kind of a summary of my feelings about the various places where I've lived. So the first is the red. I started off by telling you about the vast poppy fields in Kyrgyzstan, but it's also the red of the flags. They signify various events in my life. Then there's the blue, the Mediterranean. Okay. And there's the green. It's the green of the Statue of Liberty. And also it's green because other immigrants, Jewish immigrants, called us greener. Greener meaning greens. We were green because we didn't know the language. We didn't know anything. Okay. It was a kind of a slur against newcomers. Because when I came to the US, I didn't come with a wave of immigrants. We were just like one family. There were very few immigrants that year, actually. So we were kind of an oddity among the group of Jewish people that we knew in New York, and they called us the Greens. So another reason for the green. People who read the book will get a deeper sense of why these colors are there and what they represent. But I hope that your listeners will know that this is a book about what happened after the Holocaust. It's not about the Holocaust. It's about how it affected me growing up. But at the very core of it, it's an optimistic book, because I'm an optimistic person and my life has turned out very well.
So for anyone else listening who's interested, how did you get into the Bronx High School of Science? How'd you do it?
I have to read the book.
Oh, fair enough. That's
it.
worth the price of the book right there.
You know, I have to tell you, this is a very funny story. I got an email from someone I don't know, a woman, who said, I'm the granddaughter of the former principal of the Bronx High School of Science, Dr. Morris Meister. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know you. I don't know him. I know he was a principal, but he had retired the year that when I started was a brand new principal. And she said, well, my grandmother and my mother told me a story. They knew about the girl who went into Bronx High School of Science not knowing a word of English. Is that you? And I said, I'm afraid it is. So I invited her to my book launch, and she was just very excited to meet me.
Well, you're a legend. You are a legend. And if any of our listeners want to learn a little bit more about you, Annette, is there a website? Are you on social media? What can you share with our listeners?
Yes, I do have a website. It's my name, Annette Berkovits, BERKOVITS.com, AnnetteBerkovits.com. There's everything about my books on my website, and a blog and all sorts of things. And I have a Facebook author page. I don't do Twitter and Instagram very frequently, but I'm there sometimes.
Okay. No TikTok for you?
No, I have to. My grandson has to teach me. I learned these technologies from my grandkids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good, Annette. Thank you so much for letting me uncork your story. I had a good time.
Thank you, Mike. You're a very good interviewer. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, Please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.